Pleasure being here this evening. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the museum for arranging this talk. And so this evening I'm just going to give some additional historical context concerning the history of women during the first 2 decades of the 20th century to complement the excellent installation of the 1910s to 1900 to 1919 of the Decades exhibition. And this period was a transformative time for women in U.S. history, and I'm going to focus on U.S. history, but I'm also going to draw upon the experiences of women in Europe during this period, and I'm going to focus on the figure of the new woman, but talk about women more broadly during this era. And I want to stress that women's experiences were so varied, and I'm going to try to emphasize some important changes in conceptions of womanhood, women's experiences, but also the persistence of some limitations and challenges that women face throughout this period. So during this period in the United States, the progressive era emerged, and this was a period that was characterized by social reform movements that were aimed at tackling some of the problems that industrialization and rapid urbanization presented, and this period represented a significant reevaluation of women's roles in the public and private sphere, and the notion of this dichotomy between the public and private spheres that was gendered emerged in the 18th century, and it was a really enduring ideology that continued to influence social norms in throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And according to this ideology, the domestic sphere was the realm of women, and women were responsible for moral stewardship, child rearing, and household management, and many women embraced this model and appreciated recognition of their roles as wives, mothers, and caregivers. And conversely, the public domain was presented as the realm for men, for economic activity outside of the home, and also for formal politics. And this is an ideology that was espoused by upper class and middle class people, but it didn't really match up with the realities of people in the lower classes who had no economic option besides work outside the whole home, especially for people in urban areas. And so despite the prevailing ideology of female domesticity, the turn of the century marked a shift in constructions of womanhood, and there was a new figure that emerged at the end of the 19th century and continued to gain sort of strength in the early 20th century, known as the figure of the new woman. And this emerged in the United States and also Western Europe as well. And so the figure of the new woman wasn't content with the confines of the home and embraced roles and entered into public spaces that had been male-dominated or exclusively reserved for men. And so this figure of the new woman was something that was a departure from Victorian gender ideals and encompassed a range of different sort of types. And this included suffragettes, and I'll talk about suffragettes toward the end of my talk, also progressive reformers, bohemian feminists, college students, bicyclists, militant working class activists, and actresses. And these varied incarnations of the new woman collectively symbolized a bold assertion of women's public presence in work, education, entertainment, and notably politics. And so the expanding public role often coexisted with the expectations that women continue to fulfill their domestic responsibilities. And during this period, only a small fraction of women attended college, only a small fraction of men attended college during this time as well. But those women who did attend institutions of higher education and were doing so in greater numbers would attend either women's colleges or co-education educational facilities, and women were often entering these institutions of higher learning to pursue careers in teaching, nursing, library science, among other fields, and that's one of the images that you'll see in the gallery. The top image, there's teachers from a teaching college in Alabama in 1917, and then also some female students observing a dissection in Philadelphia in 1911. And so at college campuses, many women felt a newfound freedom to explore their intellectual interests, to cultivate close friendships, and foster a sense of community. And based on letters and memoirs of women during this time, we can see that these experiences proved to be sort of immensely valuable for the women who attended these institutions in terms of shaping their identities and also allowing them to lay claim to roles that the generation before them had not very commonly embraced. And so breaking away from the traditional confines of the domestic sphere, the new woman actively sought employment and career opportunities. Some women had entered the teaching professions, nursing profession, and the pursuit of professional life granted them some financial independence and a sense of identity outside of their identities in terms of marriage and the family. And I'll talk a little bit later about the identities and experiences of lower class industrial workers and other women workers who had less mobility and less opportunities. And many of the women who represented this figure of the new women were involved at the forefront of social reform movements, and this is particularly middle class and upper class women who were advocating for suffrage, progressive reform, so suffrage being the women's right to vote, and they often championed progressive causes addressing significant issues such as poverty, workers' rights, inequality, and in their personal lives they advocated for more equitable marriages based on companionship and equality rather than subservience and an economic necessity. And they also sought greater control over their reproductive rights. And so this was a period in the beginning of the 20th century that witnessed the beginnings of the birth control movement, and the most prominent figure in this movement was Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger faced persecution for her efforts to educate women about birth control methods and their reproductive rights. So in the 1910s, Sanger, who was a nurse, had become a prominent figure in terms of her advocacy for birth control, and she established a clinic in the U.S. in Brooklyn, and this was founded in an immigrant neighborhood. It proved to be the foundations for Planned Parenthood, and the nurses and the workers typically spoke Yiddish, English, Italian, Russian, and other languages because it was in the heart of a working class neighborhood with a high proportion of immigrants. And Sanger's clinic advertised their services in newspapers, particularly in immigrant press, but they didn't specifically mention birth control or contraception in these advertisements. But even with this omission of this language, still just 10 days after the clinic had opened in 1916, the police shut it down. New York police shut it down for violating the Comstock Act, and the Comstock Act was passed in the 1870s, and it was a set of statutes that made it illegal to circulate obscene material or similar materials that mention sex education, pornography, abortion, or contraception. And and this would be material that went through the U.S. mail. And during the first day of operations, or prior to Sanger's arrest, the clinic was serving 150 people, and by the 10th day, it was seeing 450 women. But the 10th day was its final day, because after Sanger was released from jail, she tried to reopen the clinic, but was arrested again, and the clinic was forced to shut down. And her trial became a national media event, and the judge had offered to free her and not imprison her if she was willing to not reopen her clinic, but Sanger refused, and she was sent to jail for 30 days, and in jail she went on a hunger strike. Her sister also went on a hunger strike, and the jailers force-fed her, and this attracted media attention, and Sanger's efforts ultimately paved the way for significant changes in public perception concerning birth control, and Sanger believed that women were never going to be equal unless they had access to birth control. And without reliable methods of birth control, women couldn't prevent pregnancy and childbirth. And it's worth mentioning that childbirth was fairly perilous. Maternal mortality rates were 30 to 50 times what they are today in the U.S. And maybe it's roughly about 6 to 9 out of 1,000 women who went into childbirth died. And also 1 in 5 children died within the first 5 years of their lives. And it's also worth noting that by 1910, abortion had become illegal at every stage of pregnancy in every state in the United States. But prior to the late 19th century, it had been a very widely accepted practice prior to that point. And so now we're going to shift gears a bit to fashion. And in terms of fashion, the New Woman was synonymous with more practical and less restrictive clothing that was emblematic of increased freedom and mobility. And so on the image, those of you who are familiar with the exhibition or familiar with the images on the left, it's on the far left is a woman who's the daughter of a Texas governor, and I believe that's a photograph from 1900. You can see that it's more tightly fitted, restrictive clothing, and on to directly to her right, that's a British actress, and I believe that photograph is from 1907. You still see the persistence of tighter fitting, more restrictive clothing, but we have sort of different kinds of fashion trends that emerged during this time period, and there's fashions that are more practical for the kinds of activities that women are engaging in, and also engaging in, particularly the figure of the New Woman, engaging in sports like golf and tennis, and also bicycling. Bicycling became popular among women. And so the new figure represented a figure of modernity and change, but was also met with criticism and skepticism by those who perceived her to be disruptive to the established social order. And on the image on the far right, we have a depiction of a new woman on wash day. And may I ask any of you to share if you notice any symbols or trappings of a new woman, anything about her appearance that is indicative that it's a new model of femininity?
Well, she's got pants on it, just the tilt of her head.
Exactly. It's an extremely sort of confident, dominant posture, and yes, she is wearing these like pants or knickers, and actually during this time period, although we have a depiction of a woman wearing pants, women did not, this is exceptional, women did not wear pants during the time, and in the 19th century, women had adopted bloomers, but they decided that it was actually a distraction from their cause of suffrage, and it was extremely rare for any woman to wear trousers or knickers. Did you have something else that you wanted to note?
It's like that it's the guy who's doing the washing.
Exactly. So you see that it's the man doing the washing, and you also see that the woman has a cigarette, her bicycle is in the background. And this isn't a depiction that is revering the figure of the new woman, but sort of mocking it and presenting it's in a lighthearted way, though, pointing to some of the anxieties that people had about women feminizing men, having that by them wearing the pants, then men would be emasculated and they would take over domestic duties. And so some people feared different fashion trends feared the implications of what it would mean if women wore the pants, and then they'd be dominating their henpecked husbands. Yes, please.
As the picture, is that a mantle there? The picture?
Oh, the stocking or the legs or the... Yeah, I don't know what it's about.
Symbolic or something.
Your guess is as good as mine, but yes, you see above the mantle the stockings and and immigrant workers, particularly and those from Eastern and Southern Europe, often found work in the garment industry that had been booming, or as domestic servants. So domestic service was the most common occupation of women during this time period, and industrialization had begun initially with the textile industries, and so it had been quite some period of time that you had the industrialization of textile and garment industries, and as I mentioned, the rates of immigrant and African American workers were higher relative to white women, and domestic service was a very common profession for both white women and black women during this period, and many lower income women worked taking in laundry or performing domestic work for wealthier families to supplement their incomes, supplement either their paid wages or their household incomes. And women workers, particularly in the garment industries, and this is one of the images from the exhibition, had faced long hours sewing shirts, dresses, and other items, and often overcrowded and unsanitary factory conditions. And factory workers typically worked very long hours, often 10 to 20 hours a day. Many worked 6 days a week, and women were paid significantly less than their male counterparts, and they faced unsatisfactory and sometimes very dangerous working conditions. And then this ideology of domestic spheres justified them being paid lower wages because of the ideal that the man should be the breadwinner in of the house, so any money that the wife comes in is just supplementary. And that's one reason why women and child laborers were attractive to employers, because they worked very hard for less than what the male workers were earning. And I'm presenting here some images in the middle of the 1910s from a factory in Mobile. And the harrowing conditions in which many women labored during the 20th century were starkly revealed by a devastating fire that occurred in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City in the year 1911. And many of these workers in this particular factory, like other garment factories at the time, were young women. Women in this factory were working beginning at the age of 14, and many of them were Italian and European Jewish immigrants, and they had come to the United States with their families to try to seek a better life, but they faced lives of grinding poverty and quite difficult working conditions. And so in this particular tragedy, there was 146 workers. These were predominantly young immigrant women who had lost their lives due to this fire that had broken out, and there were a number of critical factors that contributed to the calamity, one of which were locked exit doors and also insufficient fire escape routes and facilities. And there was these fire ladders that had arrived on the scene to try to save the people in the burning building, but the ladders of these fire engines could only reach the 6th floor, but there were many more floors that were higher than that, and the women who were on the higher floors, particularly the 8th and 10th floors, in a desperate bid for survival, had managed to flee to the roof, and they descended the stairs, or they used the elevator before it ceased functioning, but then the elevator ceased functioning, and the workers on the 9th floor were unable to escape to the roof or fire escape because the owners had locked them in to their working space because they had been concerned about trying to prevent them from speaking with labor unionizers because they didn't want them to unionize. And during the fire, there was a poorly constructed fire escape that collapsed, and that led to many more deaths, and as a result of this, many people jumped to their deaths, and in some cases their bodies were burning, and onlookers were seeing this, and it was a really horrifying scene to those who were on the street, and it was sort of a gruesome testament to their desperation and the terror in the moment, and some were the people who were too afraid to jump. They perished in the smoke and flames, and there was widespread media attention to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and it sparked a great deal of public outrage and outcry, and it became a pivotal moment in the labor movement in the U.S., and it helped catalyze significant reforms in labor laws and safety regulations, and many women were at the forefront of these efforts for labor reform and also unionization in the wake of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and those are some images in the immediate days following the tragedy. And the event had served as a somber reminder of the risk and vulnerabilities that were faced by women workers during this time period, sort of underscoring the imperative for change and the ongoing struggle for workers' rights and safety. And so in response to demanding and often very perilous working conditions, the progressive era saw a wave of reforms that was aimed at ameliorating these conditions and improving the plight of workers, with the particular focus on workers who faced not only dangerous working conditions, but for women, discriminatory wages and limited opportunities for advancements. And activists actively campaigned for an 8-hour workday and enhanced working conditions. There's also reform for child labor laws, and you do see reforms, some of which are being skirted by employers, but the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire had revealed the need for these reforms and brought attention to the hazardous working conditions for many workers, particularly in the garment industry. There were machines that were operating without stopping in the case of accidents that made it quite risky to operate the machinery. And the reforms that followed, they came as a result of significant pressure from the increasing power of labor unions and labor organizations that played this significant role in shaping the modern American workforce. And the outbreak of World War I also transformed the workplace, and the war had begun in 1914. The U.S. entered the war in 1917, showing some images from British female workers in munition factories. And the war had significantly altered not only the quantity, but also the nature of job opportunities that were available for women. And with a large number of men serving in the military, women stepped into roles that were crucial in sustaining the war effort and their countries, and they went beyond traditional realms of employment that they had previously occupied. And so in 1917, the U.S. entered the war, and the U.S. entry in the war brought some unique opportunities for female workers. For example, the United States recruited about over 200 women to be telephone operators deployed in Europe during World War I, and they were known as Hello Girls, and these were bilingual operators photographed there who were pivotal in ensuring effective communication at the front, and so they served in these war efforts, but they had a great deal of trouble trying to get the status to be recognized as veterans after the war. And there was also hazards that the war exposed women to because of hazardous conditions in factories that were making watches. So there was a group of women who became known as radium girls who suffered health problems due to exposure to radium and had radiation poisoning as a result of painting wash dials and ingesting the poisonous substance. And the experiences of women who are leading the suffrage movement sort of belies this depiction that these women were remarkably committed, and some of these women, well, as a give an example, even risked and lost their lives for this cause. And much of the movement for suffrage in the U.S. focused on suffrage at the state level, and by 1912, several states, particularly in the American West, had granted women full or partial voting rights, and these victories were deemed crucial as they demonstrated the practicality and justice of granting women suffrage and creating momentum for a constitutional amendment in the United States. And one of the most notable events was the women's suffrage procession in Washington. And that's in the exhibit, and you can see that there. This is a photo depicting the D.C. March on March 3rd, 1913, and this was organized by Alice Paul for the National Women's Party. And so this was not only the first suffragist parade in Washington, D.C., but it was also the first large organized march on Washington for any political purpose. And this event was staged the day before that Woodrow Wilson's had his inauguration ceremony. And so this was a strategic move for the timing of the event to try to draw the maximum amount of public attention. And the parade included thousands of women, and it faced hostile crowds and became a turning point in the movement, highlighting the challenges that suffragists faced and garnering sympathy and support for their cause. And during this time, the suffrage movement began to shift tactics from state-focused campaigns to a more concentrated effort for a constitutional amendment, and suffragists started to get more broad-based public support for their cause, and this was partly due to the strategic campaigns of suffragists, and also partly due to changing societal attitudes toward women's roles, especially in their wake of their contributions during World War I. And suffragists increased their public activism, organizing rallies, parades, and also speaking tours across the country. And they also began to exert more direct pressure on the federal government and regularly had protests outside of the White House. And Inez Mulholland, a suffragist and labor lawyer, is remembered for her iconic image leading the suffrage parade. She's there on the horse, and that was in 1913, but her most poignant moment came in 1916 during a speaking tour across the United States in which she gave 50 speeches in 11 days, and she had been severely ill in Los Angeles when she delivered a passionate speech for suffrage that ended with the question, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And those ended up being her last words because she collapsed at the event, and she died at the age of 30 and becoming a martyr for the cause. And in Britain, there was a more militant direction of the suffrage movement that became known as the suffragette movement. And so the suffragette refers to a militant faction of the women's suffrage movement, and the leader in Britain was Emmeline Pankhurst. And this movement was characterized by more controversial and confrontational tactics than in the U.S., and one of the most notable suffragettes was Emily Wadding Davison, and in 1913, during the Epsom Derby, Davison stepped onto the race course and was fatally struck by King George V's horse, and there's some ambiguity whether she had meant to commit suicide or not, but her death was one of the most shocking and stirring moments in the struggle of women's suffrage and received widespread media coverage, and some people viewed her acts as extreme and wrong-headed, but others saw it as a symbol of the lengths to which women were willing to go to for the suffrage movement. It's important to keep in mind that racial, social, economic, and geographic divisions often meant that the progress of the era was unevenly felt. Women of color, particularly African American women, faced compounded discrimination, and those in rural environments grappled with different challenges than those in their urban counterparts. And so the history of women during this time period, and like every time period, is not a monolith, but a wider range of diverse narratives and experiences, including those shaped by race, class, sexuality, marital status, occupation, and age. And the achievements of the suffrage movement, as significant as they were, did not fully bridge this divide. And for many, the battle for equality continued long after the 19th Amendment's ratification, and one could argue that the battle is still continuing alongside ongoing efforts to achieve a more just and inclusive society through this day. Thank you.